their lobby day. And Paul, our speaker, was also there. I didn't meet him because Claudette was off on one side of the room and I was off on the other side of the room or whatever. But that's how they met and engaged, and he eventually ended up here as a guest of Beth ME and the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which you're going to hear about. So I would like to first introduce them, Claudette St. Pierre, to talk a little bit about the local FFRF group, and then to introduce our speaker.
Great. Thank you, Becky. Can you guys hear me okay? I have a pretty loud voice. At least my husband tells me that. I'm Claudette, and I am the chapter president of the Freedom from Religion Foundation Metro Denver chapter. How many of you are familiar with Freedom from Religion Foundation? Okay, so there's some people that aren't familiar. I'll the organization itself, and then we'll get to the speaker introduction. But real quick, the Freedom from Religion Foundation was founded 40 years ago in Madison, Wisconsin by a mother and daughter to facilitate educating the public about the separation of church and state, and also to advocate on a legal level for separation of church and state. And the organization now has about 20 affiliate chapters throughout the United States, and they continue to advocate for the First Amendment right to freedom from religion, freedom of religion. And our chapter here locally, we help with educating the public about that important constitutional principle of separation of church and state. You can go online and find out information about the organization, and they do a lot of legal, it's primarily legal aspects. So they're fighting every time you hear one of your elected members invoking God, or just, you know, they utilize the courts, and they utilize previous court decisions to back up their stance. And as Becky mentioned, I met Paul at the Secular Coalition of America's lobby day, and so I'm excited to have him here. And then I connected with Sheila, who is part of Beth ME, and she is actually going to do the introduction of Paul. So Sheila, why don't you come up here? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Claudette. And thank you all for being here. This is very exciting. I read about the Hub a number of years ago when it was advertised in the Hub and the Boulder paper, and I thought, this is the greatest thing. I really want to get an opportunity to come visit. And it's so wonderful to be here, and especially see the quote by Carl Sagan behind me, because last night our Beth ME congregation, which is a humanistic Jewish congregation, had a little Shabbat picnic under the trees in a park in South Boulder, and to honor the eclipse week. The culmination of the eclipse week, I included some quotes by Carl Sagan, as well as Neil deGrasse Tyson, and so here we are again under his wisdom. So Beth ME is a humanistic Jewish congregation under the auspices of the Society for Humanistic Judaism, which Paul Golin represents, and he'll be doing most of the talking about that. Paul also represents an aspect of Humanistic Judaism, which involves intermarriage. We're very welcoming and open to all sorts of people. And I shared this book with him on the drive down from Boulder today, so I know he approves. Paul's intermarriage is unique and special, and to honor it, I'm going to read a couple of haikus for Jews to just set the pace here. And he'll explain why I've chosen those.
Is it?
I'm sorry?
Oh, I just was wondering if that was an actual book or...
It's an actual book. It's not virtual, but maybe you could find it virtually also.
Yeah.
So here are just a couple to put a smile on your face. And if you are a cultural Jew, as so many of us in this audience are, as I look around here, these should resonate in some way. Shocking new finding. All this worrying really will give you cancer. And to honor Paul and his family, the same kimono the top geishas are wearing, got it at Loman's. And I'll just do one more. Jewish voodoo tip: mention an acting career, then watch for chest pain. We like to have fun. We like to honor culture and heritage. We like to pass that on through various activities. We do celebrate high holidays, and you might wonder, why do secular humanistic Jews celebrate high holidays? We do it in a way that honors our culture. We have some events that are coming up in Boulder. I think I'll just leave some save the date flyers right over here. I've handed some out at the tables. And without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Paul Golin, who is a breath of fresh air with the Society for Humanistic Judaism, of which I've been a board member for a number of years. And it's been a delight to participate with him as he envisions what might happen. And that's what he's going to talk about today. So welcome, Paul.
Thank you. These are notes. I'm not playing a game. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
The great thing about asking, can everyone hear me, is that whoever can't hear me can't hear what I'm saying. So it doesn't really matter. Thank you so much for the multiple layers of introduction. About this time last week, I was celebrating my son's 5th birthday, and we did a party. And my wife is Japanese, thus the Jewish haiku, if you didn't put 2 and 2 together. So we did it at the karate studio where he is studying karate, and of course it couldn't be jujitsu. It had to be karate because of the Japanese thing. And, you know, they had his sensei. We had about 20 of his little buddies, and they were running around, and he smashed a board in half. It was balsa wood, but it doesn't matter. It was a blast, and if someone wants to see photos and you have 40 to 50 minutes afterwards, I'm happy to show them to you. But what else do you think happened at this birthday party last weekend? Any thoughts of what else might have been happening? Anybody?
Cake eating?
Cake eating, correct. Any other thoughts of what might have happened at this birthday party? Singing, happy birthday, that happened.
Games.
Games. Did he wear a hat? He didn't have a hat, but that would have been good.
Blowing out the candles.
Blowing out the candles. All of those things happen at this birthday party. I would call that ritual, right? It's a ritual. Why did we do that? You know, what did we get out of doing that ritual? Did we need to do it? Would it have still been a birthday party if we didn't do it? Secular Americans do ritual still, and what I want to talk about today is what might we bring out of our religious backgrounds that are still relevant to us, and ritual is a piece of it, and we'll talk about some other pieces as well. And I want this to be a conversation, but I want to first throw about 15 minutes of stuff at you so that we have something to talk about, and then we can talk about it or anything else that's on your mind. But I want to start with ritual because it's something that I think a lot about, as I'm executive director of the Society for Humanistic Judaism, and we do Jewish ritual, and we do it in a non-theistic way, but we still do it. And before I started a year ago at this position, I was working in the organized Jewish community as well, in a more pluralistic setting, so I was working with the other streams of Judaism. And I was even then asking them to explain, why do you do this? Why would anybody do Jewish ritual? What are they getting out of it? What's the benefit to them? And this is a question that I can ask of all kinds of rituals. So what are some of the other rituals that secular Americans of any background might be doing in their lives? Does anybody celebrate Thanksgiving here. Mhm, you do, and so what are some of the rituals of Thanksgiving? You eat a turkey or a tofurkey, is that what that thing is called? You perhaps pumpkin pie. You watch a football game.
You break the
You break a wishbone? Okay.
Not me, but.
Your uncle gets drunk and talks about his support for Trump.
No one in my family.
Okay, so, but it's ritualized, right? It's a ritualized meal. There doesn't have to be, but we take some kind of meaning out of that ritual. Another holiday that I think most of us celebrate is New Year's Eve, right? What's the ritual on New Year's Eve? Get drunk, I know. But what else do we do? Stay up late, right? Count down. Yeah.
Resolution. To old lang.
That's right, and that is, making resolutions is a really interesting thing, because there's an aspect to it that might harken back to a piece of religiosity, perhaps. So we all do these rituals, or most of us do. At one of the gatherings of the secular movement, I got to meet a guy named Tom Flynn. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's VP of the Center for Inquiry, VP of for media, and he's been on secularity for many, many years. And he was a great guy, and he was a brilliant person to talk to. And he told me he does no rituals. And I said, certainly, when you got married, you did something more than just go down to City Hall and sign a piece of paper. Nope. I said, well, do you do turkey at Thanksgiving? Nope. Do you do the countdown at New Year's Eve? He's like, no, we always go to bed at like around 9:30 on New Year's Eve. And I said, aha, that's your ritual. Right? You know, he has made not doing ritual his purposeful thing. So,
does he ever toast someone, click glasses?
oh yeah, clicking glasses, toasting as a ritual. Yeah, that's an interesting thought.
It's rooted in polytheism, goes back to the Greeks.
Okay. It's if you didn't hear, he's saying that toasting is rooted in polytheism and goes back to the Greeks. I will say that it's an interesting segue, because toasting is something that I believe now happens in pretty much every culture. And so because my wife is from Japan, I have done a lot of toasting in Japanese. The word is kanpai. When we got married, in New York, we had a Jewish wedding in a synagogue, and at the party, because there were a number of people that came from Japan, my wife and I explained a bit about our culture. And so for my relatives, my side, many of whom were Jewish, we taught them a few Japanese words like kanpai, which is what you say in Japan when you make a toast. And for her Japanese relatives and friends, we taught them how to say l'chaim. And then I explained to them that you got to get the so it was a lovely exchange. But that ritual, along with many others, including New Year's Eve, which seems to be a universal celebration, suggests that ritual we may be hardwired for ritual as human beings. This may be something that we just do as part of our being. And if you then extend it out to personal rituals, I would argue that we all have personal rituals, some of which are positive and some of which we probably wouldn't want to share in a room full of other people, and others that we know about that we wish we could ritualize in our lives but haven't been able to yet. So I think ritual is important. I don't think it's going away, and I think it's one of those aspects that we may want to think about what pieces from our lineage and past, and including our religious past, might still be relevant for today and to retain moving into the future. And when I think about the future, I think about a positive, secular, non-theistic future, which I hope will come to fruition. But maybe you disagree, and maybe you're like Tom Flynn and you don't see it as having to be that way, because certainly some of the things that humans are hardwired for are bad, and we try to overcome them, right? Like anger and violence, which all of us are capable of, and we use other aspects of our humanness to try to overcome that. So I'm happy to hear the counter argument for that as well. Spirituality. So this is a thing that I think religious people may feel they have a lock on. And I want to talk about this aspect of it as well, because there's the semantical piece of spirituality, which is that the word itself has the word spirit in it. So we may feel that, let's use a different word, let's call it wonderment, perhaps, but maybe that's as good a word. I think that, for me personally, I want to reclaim the word spirituality or spiritual. I feel that I have experienced spirituality, and I believe that what was happening when I experienced spirituality were chemical reactions in my brain. Okay? There was not a spirit taking over my body. I was not feeling some larger thing outside of me, but when I am seeing unbelievably beautiful nature, as I currently am from the window of my hotel room in Boulder, or when I am in the Metropolitan Museum of Art and I see something that strikes me, and I have an intellectual process that thinks about the creation of that art, but I also have this other thing, and I want to call it spirituality. It's hard to describe, but I think that most of us have had that, or all of us have had it. And because of perhaps the politics of being secular when we are a minority, we don't want to use that word, but I feel like I would like to reclaim, and I would like my movement to reclaim spirituality and redefine it and take it back. Because I think it's a positive. It's something that I try to actively achieve. And there are probably other words also for it, but certainly now that I've become a parent fairly recently, and I see things that my kids are doing that make me feel part of something larger, again, that larger thing is human history. Existence. None of the religious stuff that is beyond us. It's about us, though, but I think that I want to call it spirituality. One of the other reasons I feel on the political piece it might be worth us thinking about taking that word back, or similar words like that, is because I fear that sometimes humanism is presented in a way that allows others to stereotype us as, all like Mr. Spock. Like we are all just logic machines and we're going to approach every... And I think that's that's incorrect, and I want us to emphasize that humanism, this philosophy, is not just about the human achievements and the human work that needs to be done in the world, where we can't wait for supernatural intervention that isn't gonna save us, but and the way we do that is with logic and science, which is all accurate, but we also do it with empathy, and we do it with human emotions, positive human emotions, and we do it with other pieces of our humanity that I don't want to let religion have total claim over. So I think that there is an aspect to life that we can use words like spirituality for. There is ethics and values piece of our existence that, again, I feel like religion may feel like they have a claim over, and perhaps some of you have heard this kind of insane logic of how can you be a good person without God?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
how can you have ethics and values without religion? And it's I don't need to tell, this is I don't want to call you a choir, right? And I'm not preaching, but I'm preaching to the choir here, that if you look at history and you look at what has been done in the name of
Right.
religion, you know that there's no connection necessarily to the ethics and values. And if you look, so obviously my background and heritage is Jewish, and if you look at what the ethics and values are, the founding ethics and values, some of them are just horrible and disastrous. Now, I take pride in the constant evolution of Judaism and the correctives that have happened over the years by rabbinic Judaism, and some of you know what I'm talking about, and others may not, but you know, the source text of the Hebrew Bible is not what Judaism works on and hasn't for millennia. So in the context of living in a Christian majority country that also uses that as a source text, I can tell you that for many, many Jews, it's very distressing to have lines pulled out of that original source text that have not been interpreted the way they're interpreting it, probably since it was originally written. It's all been reinterpreted. So, for example, there are transgressions in the Old Testament that the punishment for which is stoning, right? Death by stoning. For wearing a cotton poly blend, right? As far as I know, that's never been implemented and shouldn't be. And yet, the mixing of materials in that source text is an abomination, as is, by the way, marrying somebody who's not Jewish, as is being gay. And the punishments are all pretty much the same, and they haven't been implemented. But that source line, certainly around homosexuality, is still out there and used in horrific ways. So, but this conversation around ethics and values relates to humanism and secularity, because the question is, does it all have to go? Or is there wisdom there that we lose out on if, as secular people, we have to say, I can't touch that, you know, that thing that I reject, I have to reject all of it? Or can we look at it and say, I can understand this and I can decide what I accept and what I reject. And maybe we don't need to reinvent the ethical wheel here, or maybe there's some amazing conversations waiting to happen about why we disagree with this, and how do we counter the fact that so many other Americans are still living their lives according to these Bronze Age era writings. The last piece that I want to mention in relation to this tension between what do we take with us into the future from our religious past is community. And obviously, what's happening at this very moment is proof that we don't need religion to create community. And I'm very excited to be here. I was excited to learn about the Secular Hub and that there's this physical presence, and that community can be created without religion. And we know that already because we're all part of communities that are not organized by religion necessarily. But there's a lovely book, perhaps many of you have read it, called Religion for Atheists. Have you read that? Alain de Botton. And he makes some very interesting points in that book about what religion does so well that secular folks aren't doing as well, and that we might want to learn from. I don't agree with everything he says, but he does point to some interesting pieces, and community is one of them. So it's worth reading, but to just kind of paraphrase what he's saying. He talks about physical spaces. So this is a physical space. And you talked about your Sunday brunch, where anybody can come in, right? Coffee and community. So what happens when someone who is not yet part of the community walks through those doors into a physical space that is telling them, the point of coming here is to create community around this notion, secularity. And that's the goal, the purpose. Everyone who is in this space understands that's what's happening. And he, Alain Dubuton, I'm never going to get that right. He's saying that when you look at these amazing works of architecture, particularly the Catholic Church, that have been built by the Catholic Church, although the synagogue I was married in, if you ever are in New York, it's across the street from the Central Park Zoo on 65th and 5th Avenue. It's called Temple Emmanuel. It's the Jewish St. Patrick's Cathedral. It's stunning. And it worked out because I wanted to get married by a rabbi, and my wife wanted to get married in a castle because she's a princess. But anyway, it's a gorgeous space, and what happens there, or what should happen, and frankly I don't think it happens as often as he does suggest in this book, is that walking into a space like that strips away aspects of your life, like class, or in theory, race. And you are there on this, you have this commonality with everyone else who's walking through that door. You have the one commonality, but the purpose is to meet other people. It's nobody, especially I'm in New York City, if somebody talks to you, it automatically means that they're crazy. And then you start to judge backwards of, oh, maybe this person isn't crazy. Like, that's the default for New Yorkers, sadly. But you go into a space that is purposely set up for community, and it allows you to just talk to people and potentially to become part of that community. And his claim is that that doesn't happen in the same way in the secular world. In fact, there's a lot of mechanisms now that might actually be keeping us from forming stronger bonds, stronger communal bonds that existed perhaps even in our grandparents' generation, where most people, even in the industrialized world, never really left a radius of a few miles around their home, knew everybody in their community. People were there to help out when something happened and you needed help. And we don't really have that as much. It happens at times, but it's not a regular feature of our day-to-day life. And it could be. And secular folks can create that kind of community, and perhaps this is the prototype for that. So secular humanistic Judaism was founded over 50 years ago with the recognition that Judaism, and this is where Judaism may actually be a bit different than some of the other religions, but I'm not so sure that it can also be applied to other religions as well. That Judaism is a culture. So there was a rabbi named Mordechai Kaplan who called it a civilization. Culture or civilization. The point was that the religion piece of it was a piece of it. It wasn't just a religion. This is part of the challenge for both Jews and people who aren't Jewish to understand, is that Judaism doesn't fit neatly into any of those boxes. So it's much more than a religion. It's certainly much more than an ethnicity. And in a lot of ways, people can express Jewish identity through culture alone and not do anything religiously Jewish. And secular humanistic Judaism was created on the notion that we can take what is working for us from religious Judaism and still do it with liturgy that doesn't make us feel like we're being untrue to what we believe. So we can use words that we actually believe and only say things that we believe. So if you attend these high holiday services, you will never encounter the word God or Adonai or however else, 400 other ways that we can say it. But what you will encounter is hopefully meaningful liturgy, poetry. We will draw from modern thinkers as well as ancient thinkers, but we don't necessarily throw out the baby with the bathwater, in that there is some amazing wisdom in this tradition, and we can still retain that. And that's the piece that I feel connected to in a lot of ways. Is it's been a conversation for 3,000 years. It's been a debate. one of the things I love about, so the commentary, the rabbinic commentary to that source text is called the Talmud, or one of the commentaries is called the Talmud, and it's a debate, it's an argument, they purposely keep the losing arguments in the text, in case it ever one day becomes the winning argument. So you can see this conversation that was happening 1,000 years ago around issues, some of which are completely irrelevant to today, but many of which are still very relevant to today. And there's no reason that secular people can't draw from it, because the overwhelming majority of Jewish law was about how to live life today. And it wasn't about what you should be doing in the service of God, which is another reason why I'm still connected and still feel proud to be Jewish, is this notion that this is our shot. There are, I think, 5 or 6 different notions of an afterlife in Judaism that I've heard. They're all vague. To me, that's basically a way of saying we don't really know. And it's also been horrible for Judaism marketing-wise, because it's so much better to just say, if you do this, this, and this, you will get an eternal reward. And Judaism has never said it up that way, as clear-cut as that. But certainly the Orthodox, people in Orthodox Judaism do believe in a hereafter, but even that hereafter happens here. It doesn't happen in the sky. So there's always been a piece of this notion in Judaism that this planet, this is what we have. So I kind of, maybe I'm grabbing at straws here, but I got to experience my first, and I'll tell you that I did not go to high holiday services for 25 years. And then I became executive director of the Society for Humanistic Judaism and felt it would be bad form not to be a member of one of our local communities. So I joined the most expensive community, which is in New York City, and went to the high holiday services last year. And it was an eye-opener because, first of all, I didn't realize how much thinking around the liturgy I had been doing. I grew up in the conservative movement. I've been to my friends' kids' bar and bat mitzvahs and other events in the Jewish community. I've been a Jewish community professional for almost 20 years, so I've been around the traditional liturgy a lot. And it wasn't until these high holidays that I realized the mental dance I was doing when I hit those words of, okay, I'm going to fill in my own meaning for God. And that's what most Jews are doing in the Reform and Conservative movement, because they don't think of God as this wise old man with a beard on a throne in the clouds. But the reason why I didn't go to the high holidays as an adult was because of the traditional liturgy, because it said God rewards the good and punishes the wicked. And I grew up knowing my grandmother, who was a Holocaust survivor, and I knew a bit of what she went through, and that she lost 2 children during the war. And even at age 10, I thought to myself, what could she have possibly done that was so wicked that she deserved that suffering, let alone what her infants could have done, right? So, I think that and there was no room for a conversation, of course, about my doubts, so I felt very isolated, and maybe many of you had the similar experience, and even in other religions as well. The conversation wasn't happening. So one of my goals within the Jewish community is to get that conversation going, so that other people, even in the other movements, are at least talking about it, because once you open up that conversation, the majority of Jews don't believe in a God that answers personal prayers. And that's profound, and that the Jewish community is not having that conversation in a big enough way. But when you look at studies of Jews that ask the question about God, it's off the charts compared to the rest of Americans, how many atheist Jews there are, and we're still calling ourselves Jews. So this might be a model for other religions to secularize in some ways without having to give up what works, what's still good within those religions as well. So this is a bit of how I've been approaching it, but I'm here to listen and learn as well, so I'd love to just open up the conversation now and hear from you about what you're bringing with you into the future from your religious heritages, if you grew up with one, or if you felt some kind of connection to it, or is it completely out of bounds for the secular community to be drawing from religious traditions? Who wants to jump in first? Sure.
I really appreciate your sharing, and it's very stimulating. And
Well, you know what? Can I ask everyone to stand up because it'll make them louder so that everyone can. Thank you.
I appreciate everything you're saying, and it is provocative and stimulating. Just toss out one response on the spirituality issue. Part of my own journey was, maybe 10 years ago, starting to think about the immortality of the soul. And coming out of a more philosophical background, started to really question that. And over the years, looking at that scientifically, neurologically, and so forth, I came to the conclusion that that is, one, it's part of dualism, and so that once I rejected that, that allowed me to move more in the direction of being a naturalist, a materialist, and above all, a monist. And
So is there something from your religious background that you still retain today?
No.
Okay.
And I had a pretty serious religious background.
Okay, well, that's.
But we still look for simple rituals. But I think in terms of like the issue of spirituality, I think the main concern I would have around that is that it could open the door to dualistic thinking.
Right.
That the sense of self is rooted in something that, for different terminology, would be the soul.
Yeah.
Or independent spirit, or there's something independent of me that is not reduced to being a materialistic self.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, and like I was saying about Judaism, but I think this applies to secularity too. It's just the worst marketing to say, yeah, when you're dead, you're dead. It's
That is exactly what my
I mean, well,
said to me.
it sucks, and yet no one marketed it that way to me, and yet I came to that conclusion, and lots of other people just come to that conclusion. And of course, what we have to do instead is be inspirational about the moment, and it's challenging because the alternative is wishful thinking, and frankly, I'm not making a value judgment on that wishful thinking, because it provides hope for people, and as long as they're not imposing it on me, then that's great for them. And so my wife and I would call my wife non-theistic, but there's a strain of her Japanese heritage. Japanese are as agnostic as the Jews, but she has this Buddhist and Shinto heritage that influences her thinking, and I've heard moments of potential belief in reincarnation. And when we lost our dog a couple of years ago, and she said, I feel like I'll see him again, I'm not gonna, am I gonna say, no, you will never see him again? It's, right? So we're put in that difficult position, but it was, and that was a learning experience for me, because my son at that time was 3, and I had to talk about death with him way sooner than I thought I was going to. And I didn't say anything that I didn't believe. Like, that's kind of the mantra in our movement is, we say what we believe and we don't say what we don't believe. And I tried my best to keep it there and talked about how, he lives on in our memory and our love for him, and we'll always remember him. And that was it. And luckily, at 3, he really didn't have a conception of it and didn't ask me any hard questions back. But about a year later, but his name was Pee-wee. Not ironically, he was a Chihuahua. So he still comes up. And I think that because of it, my son actually is more aware, or maybe because of what I do. So it comes up, and about a year later, he said to me, "Is Pee-wee in the sky?" Now, where did he get that from? Because it wasn't from me, but just by being a 4-year-old in America, he got the notion that, after death, you float up to the sky. And my aunt, again, totally thrown for a loop, and the first thing out of my mouth was, "That's what some people believe." And should I second guess myself there? I just left it at that. And so I'm thankful that there's a community in New York where when he's ready, so right now he's learning Japanese because we're going to do the Japanese side, but then when he's old enough to prepare for bar mitzvah and to learn about the Jewish side, that there's a community that will allow him to do that in a way that won't be inculcation into religiosity. Yeah, sorry.
So my ritual is the Passover Seder. I mean, I can't give that up. That's incredible. But what I have found is how much ritual for me is connected to identity, and identity of all the parts of myself outside of being Jewish, because that one's taken care of when you show up for the meal. So for me, over the years, I've hosted my own Seders where I had like a lesbian Haggadah, social justice perspective. Now I go to the, every year I go to the gay and lesbian Passover Seder that we have in this town. And then, then I have to deal with the parts of me that feel alienated by the religious God part that's still there. I find as just multiple parts of my identity is that throughout life I will probably continue to compromise in certain spaces, and there's not really like one space that has the perfect, it's only in my head, the perfect.
So let me ask a follow-up question, which is, and I'm asking this of everyone really, can you articulate what does it do for you?
Oh my God, it's so powerful. It's very powerful. I feel connected to myself, to my past, to my history, to the values that are part of Passover, the imprisonment and then the liberation. I mean, social justice people have taken that ceremony in great places and talked about that as human themes, and that I think that's what really resonates with me, probably, yeah.
I think articulating for people what ritual or what spirituality / wonderment, what any of it does for us as secular people is an important part of what we need to be doing as a movement so that folks can really understand how it works for you. Why would you do it? And again, I've been saying this in the Jewish community in a pluralistic way because in the liberal streams of religious Judaism like Reform and Conservative, it's still basically, we do this because this is what Jews are supposed to do. And nobody's doing it. Like a tiny percentage of Jews are doing it on a weekly basis in the non-Orthodox world because there's no articulation of what does this do for you. Claudette, you had your hand up a while.
Oh, I was going to say, I think the Jewish culture is unique in the sense that there's intertwining between the religious and cultural aspect of some of the rituals, whereas I grew up Catholic, and
Have you been to the Vatican?
No, and I have no desire to go.
Well, I did. I wanted to see where all the wealth of the New World wound up. And it's not just religion. It's not just religion, but it's all religious themed. So if you are stuck on the religious theme piece of it, how can you, Michelangelo, I mean, it's worth seeing, by the way. Everyone should go see it. It's amazing. But in my mind, I'm thinking, this guy was on his back. He was doing this on scaffold. Like, I had a very intellectual connection, but then also this kind of amazement at the beauty of it. But I was thinking about the politics and all of that. It's hard to pull it out.
It's hard as an ex-Catholic who has experienced some really negative pieces with my faith growing up to hold on to anything that real. I would say the only ritual I hold on to is Christmas, but it's more the holidays. And it's funny because my brother-in-law, when I was out in Virginia visiting my sister one year for Christmas, we were decorating, and he goes, "Man, for a bunch of atheists, you guys really get into this holiday." And I'm like, hey, it's not, nobody's got
completely
a,
secular.
Nobody's got they're not claimed to Christmas. No religious organization. It can be secular if you want. So that's really the only one. Everything else gives me a bad taste.
Yeah.
It was just in the last 10 days that I heard Alain de Botton speak.
No louder, please.
This.
Can you speak louder for
Sorry.
folks?
So,
Where was that? Where did he speak?
actually, I downloaded a recording of
okay.
him speaking in Sydney, Australia.
Okay.
Who was that?
Alain
Alain
de Botton,
Alain
who is an alternative voice to Richard Dawkins. He mentions Richard Dawkins not agreeing with him in his talk. Several things that struck me about that is the purpose of ritual, which I think you've kind of mentioned, that you've kind of recast the ritual into a sense of liberation rather than specifically a historical event. And he, I thought, advocated such a thing, is that you can take an existing ritual, recasting it into a meaningful way, relating to something about your relationship to the natural world, for example. Something that may be Christmas. Something that atheists commonly do is they have solstice events. Again, trying to relate it to the natural world. The other thing about community is he talks about, you mentioned the loss of something dear to you is an example of how life is difficult, and we need to have community and resources in community that help us get through the difficultness of life, which he pointed out kind of indirectly that Richard Dawkins felt that we had no need for that because we have science. He disagrees in saying, no, there is the emotional aspect we're talking about, and we need support to get through the emotional difficulties of life.
Great, thank you. Yeah. You had your hand up.
I was just going to say that both what you're
Louder.
talking
You
about
gotta speak loud.
is the ritual for me that really resonates is sitting Shiva. And that
Sitting Shiva, that is the Jewish ritual after a close family member passes away.
to what you're saying is it's just the psychology of it, where you are all forced to be together, and to all the traditions that are a part of that, not necessarily the religious aspect, but just that's something that I've experienced a lot, and it would be very sad to not be able to, or not have that experience.
Yeah, and in this book, Religion for Atheists, he does talk about Shiva and the value of it. He talked about it in relation to community and your responsibility to community, and recognizing that there are things that can happen to you that can push you so far away from community that you may never get back. And so he saw the ritual of Shiva as acknowledging that and allowing you to be away from community, to be different as you get over it. So the actual ritual is that for 7 days, when you're sitting Shiva, you don't do anything, and the community does stuff for you, and you're not supposed to look in a mirror, and you're supposed to rip your clothes. I mean, there's a lot of rules, as there are in everything in Judaism, but it's a 7-day block. And Did I get that wrong? I got it wrong. Close enough, close enough, close enough. Then you got a 30-day block from the time the person dies, in which it's lightened, but you're still relieved of some of your communal duties. And then you've got the 1-year block when you do an unveiling of the tombstone after a year. And at that point, you're then expected to resume normal activity within the Jewish community.
And you still have the yurt site. You still
Yeah,
have
and you
the
still have a memory,
annual
an annual memory of it. Right. So the thinking is that it's an acknowledgement that immediately afterwards, you're just in no space to do anything for anybody, and they should do it for you. And then it lightens a bit, but is still there for a month, and then it's even still there for a year. But so it doesn't have to be that way. And in fact, most of the liberal Jews who I've gone to Shiva for, sit Shiva for a day or two. But it is meaningful because it helps you at a time that you need help. But more importantly, you don't have to invent it yourself. It's a guideline, right? And if you're going to be orthodox in your observance of a religion, then sitting Shiva for a day or two is the wrong way to do it. But obviously I don't approach it that way. It's going to bring some kind of meaning into your life. But again, we can do this for every life cycle event and ask ourselves, isn't there something? So there are now, thankfully, humanistic clergy that can be there for you at a time of need like a funeral or a time of joy like a wedding. But there's a recognition that we want to ritualize this. We want to celebrate for a wedding in a way that is ritualized, that is not just going down to City Hall to sign a piece of paper, but we can do it in a humanistic way. And I think it is about what is your connective pieces, and a piece of it is also what your parents want. But yes, ma'am.
I struggle with wanting the Jewish religion to survive, the Jewish peoplehood to survive. And I look at myself, I was raised Orthodox. I am a totally fallen away Jew. And I say, on me, it's not going to survive. And I have 2 interfaith married children who couldn't care too much one way or the other. So my question is, I feel guilty because I believe it deserves to survive, that there are things of this culture that are extremely valuable, and I'm doing nothing to perpetuate that.
The guilt does that. That's very Jewish. Perpetuating it that way.
You beat me to it. Absolutely. Feeling guilty just means you're Jewish.
But you talk about the small number of people doing this or that. I think those who identify as Jewish, the numbers are severely declining.
No, and that's
No,
the
okay.
myth that the Jewish community is putting out there. So first of all, if you want to schlep out to Boulder tomorrow morning at the JCC, that's what I'll be talking about.
Okay.
There's actually more Jews in America today than at any time in U.S. history.
Oh, wow.
And the reason why is not because of our birth rate, which is lower than
Right.
replacement rate. The reason why is because 70% of non-Orthodox Jews over the past 5 years have married someone who's not Jewish. And this is a trend that has been happening for 40 years.
In the White House.
Including, well, she converted, so it's not an intermarriage, but yes. And
Yeah.
and the Yiddish word for that is shanda. So, but anyway, so what I would say is, first of all, survive for what purpose, right? So this comes back to me to what's the meaning, what's the value? Because if it's simply survival for survival's sake, or if it's about ethnicity without meaning, then frankly, I'm fine letting it go. And I've been working on not letting it go for 20 plus years in my career, but I can articulate what the value is that I find in it. And so that's the work that I think has to be done on the part of the Jewish community. And frankly, in my mind, if you can then articulate what the value and benefit is, and here's the lens that I use on pretty much everything I do. will this improve my life? Will this improve the lives of my family? Or will this help me make the world a better place? Right? So that's 2/3 selfish, 1/3 altruistic. I think that's a fair split for a human being. Those are the lenses we have to look through. If Judaism, Jewish culture, religion even, or Jewish ritual, Jewish holidays, if all of those things help people and make the world a better place, then let's find ways to do it and make it more meaningful. But then why is it limited only to people who are Jewish? Why isn't it completely opened up to anybody who's going to benefit from it? And the truth is, it already is, and it already has been. And every 2 years or so, the New York Times will do another article about some Jewish ritual that is now being taken on by people who, neither of whom are Jewish. For example, the wedding canopy, it's called a chuppah, is now a popular thing at weddings where neither partner is Jewish. As is, so that was an article from like 6 years ago.
Where is that happening?
People are doing it. Now, there was an article 2 years ago about the ketubah, which is the wedding contract, that is now being popularized among people, again, with neither of those spouses as Jewish. And there was an article a couple of years ago about mezuzahs, the scrolls that people put on their doorposts in New York City, that there's a lot of moving around apartments in New York, and the people who move into apartments and leave their mezuzahs up, some reporter went around talking about, well, why didn't you take that down? And that, folks were finding meaning in it. So if it provides meaning, then let's put it out there for whomever wants to do it. And the flip side, likewise, is how many Jewish Buddhists there are in the U.S. Some of the most prominent leaders of Buddhism in the United States have been Jews, and it's not because, you didn't have to be born in Tibet. They found meaning and they made it their own.
Yeah.
And I think Judaism has to compete in the marketplace of ideas and so on. But again, it's very difficult to do for the reasons I was saying. It's not easy to put us in a box, and this thing around peoplehood and ethnicity, and I am as guilty of that as anybody, because I'm ethnically Ashkenazic Jewish. I walk down the streets of New York City and think that I have Judar, and think that I can tell who's Jewish and who's not. And it's false, because it's not true. And first of all, it never was true, and it's a lot less true now that we're diversifying so much through intermarriage, that it's wrong to do it. So I only do it in my mind, and then I feel guilty about it. But it's, so it's really hard to pull out and uncouple that Jewish ethnic piece from, which is how so many secular Jews still identify as Jews. They're derided as bagels and lox and the Sunday Times type Jews, but. And I don't want to take away the meaning for them of that piece, because it has meaning for them. So this is not about taking away, but it's about creating additional tracks for meaning. Any other, yes?
Well, I just wanted to follow up on what you were mentioning about Jubus, because everyone, the whole Jewish community, is a tremendous inspiration to a people that is suffering maha dukkha, which is the great suffering right now, and that's the Tibetan people. And the Dalai Lama reached out to the not only rabbinical community, but to secular Jews as well, as a way of inspiration and motivation. How can the Tibetan people survive under the horrific conditions that are getting worse, by the way? They are not being freer. The oppression is stronger, and the self-immolation is increasing. And so the Dalai Lama has looked to the Jewish people as inspiration and as guidance, as our survival for 4,000 years.
And I think that it raises another point of connection for me to Judaism, and to answer that question of, well, anybody who's white, can come to America and in a generation become American and leave whatever the ethnicity was behind. And I hope everyone understands that when I say who's white, that I'm saying that that's a bad thing. But it's the reality right now, unfortunately. But why is it that I'm fourth generation American on my dad's side, I'm first generation on my mom's side, that I still choose to identify as Jewish if I'm secular? One of the pieces is the minority status. Yes. And now we've all got a minority status because we're secular in America, and that's a minority status. And so if being part of a minority doesn't make you feel a connection with other minorities, then who are in need of help, then I feel like something's not really working for you about being a part of a minority. I feel like there's actually a benefit in being a part of a minority, that it increases empathy to be part of a minority, and that's a good thing. Now, my children will be a minority because they're mixed race, although they're not brown or black, but they're mixed race, and they're dual faith. So they're a minority in the organized Jewish community, not in the Jews of America. They're not the minority anymore, but in the organized Jewish community, they're the minority. People will say to them, thinking this is funny, you don't look Jewish. That's still a phrase that is used by Jews, and it's negative, and it hurts people, and it needs to stop. And it's been used, a generation ago it was used for against blonde women, as if there were no blonde Jews, which is not true. But there was a notion about that kind of intermarriage, and now it's used against racially diverse Jews. And it's ridiculous because Jews have always been racially diverse, so it comes from a point of ignorance, of not understanding that there have always been, at least since diaspora 2,000 plus years ago, there have always been diversity racially and ethnically in the Jewish community. So that piece of minority status is something I take pride in and try to hold on to and try to use. All of this needs to be useful to us. Otherwise, why would we hang on to it? Why would we keep doing it?
You mentioned that there is this cultural portion of Judaism. Is that not also very strong in Islam? And this is one of the challenges for the secular community to try to effect change in Islam, is because it's not just religion, it's a way of life.
Right.
Is that the same kind of cultural thing that you're talking about?
I don't want to answer it without having enough knowledge, which I don't have. The question was about, isn't Islam also tied into culture in a similar way as Judaism? My understanding is that it is, and I don't want to